Hi, I'm Julie, and I'm here with my colleague Jasmine to talk about the cycle of special education. Uh, for students to become eligible, there's a process that they go through. Initially, there has to be some kind of presenting concern, and that could come from a teacher, a parent, a physician, or other person. And normally they would notify the district, usually in writing, that they're requesting assessment for special education. Once we receive that assessment, there's a number of things that can be done. Ideally, we would like to hold what's called a student study team, where we gather a group of folks who know the student, including the child's teacher and administrator, and discuss what the concerns are and ways that we may be able to address that. The outcome of that student study team may be a recommendation for assessment or maybe other recommendations. Regardless, we need to respond to the parent within 15 days of receiving that referral. And normally we would move forward with an assessment unless there is very, very clear reasons and data to support that the student should not be assessed. The informed consent, at that time, an assessment plan, a written assessment plan would be provided to the parent, and it would have information as to what areas the student would be assessed in. The parent then must provide written consent to that for us to proceed with an assessment. Once we receive that assessment plan back from the parent, the date of that receipt starts the 60-day timeline for the district to conduct an assessment. Within that 60 days, we would assess the student with a multidisciplinary team, depending on what the areas of concern are. It would, at a minimum, include the school psychologist and a special education teacher. It may also include other areas of concern, such as speech and language, occupational therapy, or adapted PE. Within that 60 days, a written report must be provided by all of the assessors and a meeting held within that 60-day timeline. At that IEP meeting, an IEP would be developed. It is a formal document similar to a contract, and it includes a number of pages. One of the key pages would be what's called the PLOP, or the present levels of performance. It is a small snapshot of the student's current level of performances based on the assessed data. From that snapshot, including strengths and weaknesses, we would be developing goals that would target the areas of deficit. And from those goals, we would be identifying what services and supports, and as Ray notes, that is a set of services and not a placement. And that would include some area of specialized academic instruction, either with a special ed teacher or a speech and language therapist. At that IEP, once that information is identified, we would identify what the appropriate placement for that student would be, and how all of the information would be implemented. All of the IEP is reviewed annually at a minimum, or more frequently if requested. And the student would also have a triennial evaluation once every 3 years or sooner if there's an identified need for that. Next slide, please. Anybody want to add anything on that? So the referral for special education, as I mentioned before, could come from a number of sources. Ideally, the general ed setting would have, quote, exhausted all on-site interventions that are available prior to a referral. At times when referrals come from the parent, because there may be some identified deficits, we may not have exhausted all those areas and move forward with an assessment. I've already noted that the referral can begin when an administrator, teacher, doctor, neighbor, or the parent formally refers the student or requests in special education. That triggers the timeline that we just discussed. and moving forward or declining the assessment requires what's called a prior written notice. That's one of the pages in the IEP. And that provides parent notice that we either will be initiating the assessment or denying their request for an assessment. And again, if we do deny that assessment, we must have significant data that shows that there are no areas of concern, no areas of deficit, and that we could defend that information should the parent challenge us. Next slide.
Jules, can I just chime in real quick? You did talk about the SST process. I just
Yeah.
want to make sure that everyone knows that the SST process is part of the general education
Correct.
Area. So it's not something that special ed is doing. Special ed is not holding the SST process. It's something that the general ed counterparts, the admin, their general education teachers are involved in that process. And then after that SST process is when the special education team is usually involved if we are going to move forward with that assessment.
But in the event that the parent requests an assessment in writing, an SST is not required, but it's highly recommended if you can do that within the first 15 days. The permission to assess, the assessment plan must be signed. The parent must provide written consent for us to move forward with any assessment, whether it's on an initial or other areas that we may be adding on later. Along with that assessment plan, when we send it home, we send, as was noted in the last slide, what's called a prior written notice that would notify the parent that our intent to initiate the assessment. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Jasmine, to talk more about this cycle.
Great. Hello again. My name's Jasmine Zartman. I was just going to also note that on the assessment page that you'd find in SACE, there are various boxes. One of them is yes, that they give consent. There's also a box for no, they do not give consent or only partial consent. So please be mindful of these various boxes. You can go ahead and turn the page now. Great. So on the assessment plan, and also to refer with the assessment plan, as was noted before, part of an assessment is observation. So that's very important. That's why we gain permission initially before we go ahead and observe the student. There's also a prior written notice that is attached to that. A prior written notice is really necessary as it's a major component of the procedural safeguards that schools must take to be available for special ed students and their parents. So when it's completed accurately, the PWN provides a clear records of decisions that have been made regarding identification, evaluation, reevaluation, placement, and changes in FAPE. Complete all the sections of the PWN as it is best practice to provide information to each section. The other area I want to note on the assessment plan is also the Medi-Cal billing section. We do have a program that allows the school district to receive federal reimbursement funds for some health services provided to Medi-Cal eligible students while they're at school. These funds are reinvested back into the school programs to benefit students and their families. FUSD can bill for assessments and services in the areas of speech language, school psychology, OT, PT, and nursing services, whether the student qualifies for an IEP or not. More information can be found in the handbook for special ed as well on this. So you also want to make sure that you're assessing in all areas of suspected disability and note if the student is an English language learner or not. You want to meet with the various specialists to collaborate to come up with appropriate assessment needs. You can go ahead and change the slide. These are the various eligibility categories that were earlier noted. When you want to look at eligibility categories, it's really important to also refer to the California Code of Regulations. These have eligibility criteria definitions. Students may also be eligible for a primary and secondary category. And it's really important to look through those criteria definitions. For example, autism does not apply if a child's educational performance is adversely affected, primarily because the child has an emotional disturbance, as they say is defined in the various sections of the regulations. Thank you so much.
Can I just interject as well that when you're considering eligibility categories, while you can take into consideration a medical diagnosis, for example, autism, but that does not necessarily guarantee that because that child has a medical diagnosis, they will automatically qualify for special education services. There has to be a definite, there has to be a, oh my gosh, I've totally blanked on my words. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. They need to meet the educational criteria for autism.
Yes, they must have a deficit, and it must be preventing them from accessing their education. So a student who has a medical diagnosis of autism, or a student who has another health impairment that might qualify them, for example, attention deficit disorder, doesn't automatically qualify them. There has to be a significant deficit displayed as well.
Right, and they may instead qualify for a 504 plan.